The twilight skies of the desolate planet, Avarice Prime, stretched endlessly, their dull hues a cruel reminder of the liminal space between life and death. The landscape was barren, dotted with jagged rocks and craters that whispered stories of forgotten wars. Lysira, the once revered queen of the Vlarithians, now sat alone on the edge of a rocky cliff, her silken robes torn and dirt-streaked. Her once luminous, moonlit skin seemed dull, her ethereal beauty a shadow of what it had been. Exile had stripped her of everything, her throne, her people, and her purpose. Her kind had deemed her compassion a fatal weakness. She remembered the trial vividly, the sneering faces of her once loyal court as they pronounced her banishment. It wasn't enough that they exiled her, they'd left her on Avarice Prime, a world devoid of sustenance, surrounded by predators that thrived on fear and despair. But Lysira had survived, though she no longer understood why. Each day she resisted the primal hunger that gnawed at her, her vampiric instincts urging her to hunt and feed. Yet she couldn't bring herself to sink into the abyss of savagery. Not yet. A sudden roar shattered the silence, jolting her from her thoughts. She turned, her sharp senses catching the sound of something, or someone, approaching. In the distance, a spacecraft spiraled out of control, its engines sputtering and flames licking at its hull. Lysira's silver eyes narrowed as the craft crashed violently into the rocky expanse below, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't entertained in ages, stirred within her. Lysira descended the cliff with grace, her movements swift and deliberate. She reached the crash site, her bare feet crunching against shattered metal and burnt soil. Among the wreckage, she spotted a figure, a human, clad in a tattered flight suit, struggling to free himself from the mangled cockpit. Ethan Carter groaned as he kicked open the cockpit door, his muscles straining against the jagged edges of the metal. He had been running from trouble, like always. The alien bounty hunters who had been tailing him for weeks had finally forced his hand, their relentless pursuit leading him to the hostile terrain of Avarice Prime. Now, as he stood amidst the wreckage of his ship, he realized he had swapped one deadly scenario for another. He barely had time to take stock of his injuries before he felt a presence. Turning sharply, he found himself face to face with a vision both terrifying and captivating. Lysira stood before him, her silver eyes gleaming in the dim light, her figure shrouded in an aura of predatory elegance. Despite the dirt and wear on her robes, there was something regal about her, an undeniable power that made his heart race. Ethan instinctively reached for the laser pistol at his side, but Lysira moved faster. In a blur she was upon him, her hand wrapping around his wrist with inhuman strength. "Don't," she said, her voice low and melodic yet edged with warning. "If I wanted you dead, you would already be." Ethan froze, his instincts screaming at him to fight, but something in her tone made him hesitate. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the situation. "What do you want?" Lysira tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I could ask you the same," she replied. "This planet is unkind to visitors, yet here you are, alive. For now." Ethan pulled his hand free, his eyes narrowing. "Thanks for the pep talk, but I don't have time for cryptic aliens. My ship's down, I'm injured, and I need to find shelter before something worse than you shows up." Lysira's lips twitched into a faint smile, the first genuine expression she'd worn in years. "You won't last an hour out here alone. The predators will smell your blood and tear you apart. Then maybe you could help instead of looming like some ghost." Ethan shot back, wincing as he adjusted his stance. His left leg throbbed, likely sprained in the crash. Lysira considered him for a moment. The human was intriguing, bold, resourceful, and surprisingly calm despite his situation. There was a fire in his eyes, one she hadn't seen in centuries. Against her better judgment, she extended a hand. "Come with me. There's a cave nearby. It's not much, but it will keep you alive." Ethan hesitated, but the pain in his leg left him little choice. Grumbling under his breath, he accepted her help, leaning on her as they made their way across the harsh terrain. Lysira led him to a hidden crevice in the cliffs, a narrow passage that opened into a small cavern. The air was cool, and the faint glow of bioluminescent moss provided a dim light. As Ethan settled against the cave wall, Lysira observed him silently. He was unlike any human she had encountered before, unfazed by her presence, yet not foolishly arrogant. His resilience intrigued her. "You're different," she said, breaking the silence. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You don't know me." "I don't need to," Lysira replied. "Most humans I've met either tremble in fear or lash out recklessly. You do neither." "Why?" Ethan shrugged, wincing at the movement. "Fear doesn't get you far. I've learned that the hard way." Lysira nodded, her expression unreadable. She leaned against the cave wall, her gaze distant. "Fear is what drove my people to this," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Ethan looked at her, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What happened to you?" She hesitated, the weight of her past pressing down on her. But there was something about Ethan, something that made her want to speak. "I was a queen," she began. "My people valued strength above all else. Mercy was seen as weakness. When I refused to destroy an innocent race during a campaign, my court turned against me. They called me unfit to rule and cast me out." Ethan listened intently, his expression softening. "Sounds like they're the weak ones, not you." Lysira blinked, surprised by his response. She had expected ridicule or indifference, not understanding. "You're an odd creature, human," she said, her tone lighter than before. Ethan smirked. "Takes one to know one." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lysira laughed, a soft, melodic sound that echoed in the cave. It was a fleeting moment, but it felt significant, a fragile connection forming between two unlikely allies. As the night wore on, the predators of Avarice Prime prowled outside the cave, their guttural growls a constant reminder of the danger. But within the cave, a tentative truce took root. Ethan and Lysira, two outcasts from different worlds, began to see in each other the possibility of survival, and perhaps something more. The air inside the cave was thick with the scent of damp moss and minerals, a stark contrast to the arid hostility outside. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his injured leg propped up on a rock. The dim glow of the bioluminescent moss barely illuminated the space, but it was enough for him to see Lysira seated against the far wall. Her silver eyes reflected the faint light, unblinking and calculating. Ethan could feel her gaze on him, not predatory, but curious, like a scientist studying an anomaly. "What's the plan now, Queen?" Ethan asked, his voice laced with sarcasm as he adjusted the makeshift splint he'd fashioned from fragments of his crashed ship. He was used to working alone, but something about Lysira's presence made him feel both cautious and oddly comforted. Lysira didn't react to the title, her lips curving into a faint smile. "First, we ensure you don't bleed out or get eaten. After that, survival will depend on whether we can outsmart the hunters." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Hunters?" Lysira's smile faded. "They're my kind, or what's left of them. Exiled like me but far less restrained. They were sent here to ensure I didn't survive long enough to challenge the court. They'd become little more than feral predators, feeding on anything or anyone they find." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And they'll be looking for you. And now for you, too," Lysira added, her tone calm but grim. "You're the perfect bait." Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Fantastic. So, not only do I have to survive this wasteland, but I've also got a target on my back. Any good news?" Lysira tilted her head, a hint of amusement flickering across her features. "You're alive. That's more than most can say when they encounter my people." "Not exactly the pep talk I was hoping for," Ethan muttered. Lysira's gaze softened. "I don't offer false hope, human. But I don't intend to let you die here either." Her words carried a weight that surprised Ethan. Despite her aloof demeanor, there was an undeniable sincerity in her voice. "Fine," he said, leaning back against the cave wall. "But if we're going to make it out of this alive, we need to work together. I don't care about your royal baggage or whatever vendetta these hunters have against you. All I care about is staying in one piece. Lysira nodded, her expression unreadable. Agreed. But if we're to survive, I need you to trust me. Ethan snorted. Trust? That's asking a lot from someone who could probably snap my neck like a twig. Lysira's lips twitched. If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't have saved you. Ethan had to admit she had a point. Reluctantly, he extended a hand. Truce, then. Lysira regarded his hand for a moment before clasping it in hers. Her touch was cold, but her grip was strong, a reminder of the power she wielded. Truce, she echoed. The fragile partnership was sealed, though either of them fully trusted the other. The first test of their alliance came at dawn. The predators of Avarice Prime had retreated, replaced by a new threat. Lysira was the first to sense it, her heightened hearing picking up the faint rustle of movement outside the cave. She motioned for Ethan to stay quiet, her finger pressed to her lips as she crept toward the entrance. Ethan strained to listen, his soldier instincts kicking in despite his injury. He heard it too, a faint shuffling sound, accompanied by low, guttural growls. Hunters? He whispered. Lysira nodded, her expression tense. They've found us. Ethan's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. What's the plan? Lysira's eyes darted around the cave, assessing their options. We can't fight them head on, not in your condition. We'll have to lure them away and pick them off one by one. Ethan frowned. And how do we do that? Lysira's gaze fell on the wreckage of his ship visible in the distance. Your ship's core, does it still have power? Ethan nodded. Yeah, but it's unstable. It could blow at any second. Perfect, Lysira said, a glint of determination in her eyes. We'll use it as a trap. The plan was simple in theory but dangerous in execution. While Ethan rigged the ship's core to detonate on a delay, Lysira acted as a decoy, drawing the hunters toward the wreckage. She moved through the shadows like a phantom, her vampiric agility allowing her to stay one step ahead of the feral creatures that pursued her. Ethan watched from his vantage point, his pulse hammering as he prepared to activate the core. The hunters were terrifying, hulking figures with sharp, predatory features and glowing red eyes. They moved with unnerving speed, their guttural growls echoing across the barren landscape. Lysira led them to the wreckage, her movements calculated and precise. At the last moment, she leaped clear of the blast radius, her body a blur of motion. Ethan triggered the core, and the explosion lit up the sky, a deafening roar that sent shockwaves rippling through the ground. When the smoke cleared, the hunters were either dead or scattered, their numbers significantly reduced. Lysira returned to the cave, her expression triumphant but weary. It worked, she said simply. Ethan managed a weak smile. Not bad, Queen. Not bad at all. As they regrouped, the bond between them began to grow. Ethan, despite his initial reservations, found himself admiring Lysira's strength and resourcefulness. She wasn't the cold, calculating predator he had assumed her to be. There was a vulnerability beneath her stoic exterior, a flicker of humanity that made her more relatable than any alien he had encountered. Lysira, in turn, was struck by Ethan's resilience. Despite his injuries and the odds stacked against him, he refused to give up. His determination reminded her of the ideals she had once fought for as a queen, ideals that had cost her everything. Over the next few days, they worked together to fortify the cave and scavenge supplies from the wreckage. Their conversations grew less guarded, and Lysira found herself sharing pieces of her past that she had long buried. Ethan listened without judgment, his empathy a balm to her wounded spirit. One evening, as they sat by a small fire inside the cave, Ethan turned to her. You know, he said, his tone light, for a vampire queen, you're not half as terrifying as I expected. Lysira raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in her gaze. And for a human, you're far more tolerable than I imagined. Ethan chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. For a brief moment, the hostility of the planet seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of camaraderie that neither of them had anticipated. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, both of them felt a flicker of hope. But hope was fleeting on Avarice Prime. Their respite was cut short when Lysira intercepted a signal from a device scavenged from Ethan's ship. It was a distress call, but not one of desperation. It was a trap. "The hunters aren't working alone," Lysira said, her expression grim as she analyzed the signal. "The court is using them to flush me out." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And now they know we're alive?" Lysira nodded. "We'll have to move fast. If they find us again, there won't be a second chance." Ethan met her gaze, his determination unwavering. "Then we'll outsmart them. Together." The partnership was no longer just about survival, it was about defiance. Together they would face whatever came next, their fragile alliance evolving into something far stronger than either of them could have imagined. The crystalline spire loomed like a beacon of treachery against the endless twilight sky of Avarice Prime. Ethan and Lysira stood at the edge of a rocky ridge, overlooking the location of the supposed rendezvous with Lysira's loyalists. From their vantage point, the spire appeared majestic, its towering structure reflecting the faint glow of the planet's dim light. But Ethan's sharp instincts screamed that this was a trap. The air was too still, the landscape too barren. It was the calm before a storm. "They're here," Lysira said quietly, her silver eyes scanning the terrain below. Her vampiric senses could detect the faint pulse of heartbeats, dozens of them, hidden among the jagged rocks surrounding the spire. Her cousin Kareth had always been a master of subterfuge, and this ambush had all the hallmarks of his cunning. "He's brought an entire squad." Ethan adjusted the makeshift harness holding his salvaged weapons. His injured leg still ached, but he ignored the pain. "Let me guess, he's banking on you walking in blindly and surrendering." Lysira's lips pressed into a thin line. "He underestimates me. He always has." She turned to Ethan, her gaze firm. "But this time, I won't face him alone." Ethan smirked. "Glad to hear it, Queen. Now, what's the play?" Lysira outlined her plan with military precision. The hunters stationed below were no mere exiles. They were Kareth's elite enforcers, fiercely loyal and deadly in their efficiency. The plan hinged on Ethan's knack for sabotage and her ability to draw attention. While Lysira would act as bait, Ethan would infiltrate the spire, disabling its defensive systems and creating chaos within Kareth's ranks. Timing would be crucial. One misstep, and they'd both be overrun. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan asked, his voice unusually serious. "If they capture you..." "They won't," Lysira interrupted. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a flicker of doubt she quickly buried. "I've faced worse. And I have no intention of letting Kareth win." Ethan nodded. "All right. Let's give them hell." Lysira descended into the valley first, her movements as fluid as shadow. She approached the spire's perimeter with a deliberate air of confidence, ensuring she was visible to the sentries hidden among the rocks. Within seconds, the first wave of hunters emerged, their crimson eyes glowing with malice. "Queen Lysira," one of them sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Kareth was right. You'd crawl back eventually." Lysira didn't flinch. Her expression was cold, regal. "And you'll regret following him." The hunter laughed, signaling to his comrades. "You think you can intimidate us? You're nothing now, a relic of a failed reign." Lysira's lips curled into a faint smile. "Then come and prove it." The hunters charged, their movements swift and coordinated. But Lysira was faster. In a blur of motion, she intercepted the first attacker, her claws slicing through his weapon with ease. Her strength and agility were unmatched, her strikes precise and devastating. For every hunter that fell, two more took their place, but she held her ground, her movements a deadly dance of ferocity and grace. Meanwhile, Ethan navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the spire's lower levels, his every step calculated to avoid detection. The interior was a stark contrast to the barren wasteland outside. Gleaming walls of crystalline material pulsed with an eerie, otherworldly light. The spire's design was both beautiful and disorienting, a testament to Vlarithian ingenuity. Ethan reached the control room, a chamber dominated by a central console surrounded by holographic displays. He quickly set to work, bypassing the Spire's security systems with a combination of human improvisation and alien technology scavenged from his crashed ship. He disabled the defensive turrets and triggered a series of localized explosions, creating the chaos Lysira had counted on. As alarms blared and the Spire's interior filled with panicked enforcers, Ethan couldn't help but grin. Showtime! Outside, the tide of battle began to shift. The explosions drew the attention of the hunters, momentarily disrupting their formation. Lysira seized the opportunity, her strikes becoming more aggressive, her movements fueled by the knowledge that Ethan was holding up his end of the plan. But the reprieve was short-lived. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing Vlarithian with features eerily similar to Lysira's. Kareth. Well, he drawled, his voice smooth and venomous. The prodigal queen returns. Lysira straightened, her silver eyes locking onto his crimson ones. Kareth. Still hiding behind others, I see. Kareth chuckled. And you're still clinging to your foolish ideals. Mercy, compassion, those are luxuries for the weak. Lysira's gaze hardened. And yet here I stand, defying you. Tell me, cousin, which of us is truly weak? Karetha's smile twisted into a snarl. You'll regret those words. The duel that followed was brutal. Kareth was every bit as skilled as Lysira, his strikes calculated to exploit her weaknesses. But Lysira fought with a determination born of more than just survival. She fought for redemption, for the ideals she had once been exiled for. Each blow she landed was a statement, a defiance of everything Kareth represented. Inside the spire, Ethan's situation grew increasingly precarious. The explosions had drawn more enforcers to his location, and his leg injury was slowing him down. He took cover behind a crystalline pillar, his pistol's energy cell running dangerously low. He needed to think fast. Spotting a series of conduits along the wall, Ethan hatched a desperate plan. He rigged his remaining explosives to the conduits, creating a makeshift chain reaction. As the first charge detonated, the entire section of the spire began to collapse, forcing the enforcers to retreat. Ethan limped toward the exit, gritting his teeth against the pain. Lysira, you better be winning out there, he muttered. Outside, the battle reached its climax. Lysira and Kareth circled each other, both visibly fatigued but unwilling to yield. Kareth lunged, his claws aimed for her throat, but Lysira sidestepped, her counterattack striking true. Kareth staggered, clutching his side, his expression a mix of rage and disbelief. It's over, Kareth, Lysira said, her voice firm. Your reign of fear ends here. Kareth sneered, his eyes blazing. You think this changes anything? You'll never be queen again. You'll always be a failure. Lysira's gaze softened, not with pity, but with resolve. Perhaps. But I'll never stoop to your level. That is my strength. With one final strike, she incapacitated him, leaving him defeated but alive. It was a choice that sent a clear message to her loyalists and the enforcers who had once followed Kareth. Strength could coexist with mercy. As the dust settled, Lysira and Ethan reunited near the spire's base. Ethan looked worse for wear, his movements labored, but his grin was intact. Looks like you handled yourself pretty well, Queen. Lysira arched an eyebrow. And you managed to survive without blowing yourself up. Impressive. Ethan chuckled. Guess we make a good team. Lysira's expression softened, a rare flicker of warmth crossing her features. Perhaps we do. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Karetha's forces had been defeated, but the stolen human superweapon loomed as an even greater threat. Together, Lysira and Ethan would face whatever came next, their fragile partnership evolving into something unbreakable. The Vlarithian throne world was a place of cold, crystalline beauty. Its towering spires seemed to pierce the dark void of space itself, their sharp, angular designs a testament to the species' ruthlessness and precision. Ethan and Lysira stood at the helm of the Loyalist ship, gazing out at the massive fortress-like structure that housed Karetha's court. It was heavily fortified, surrounded by orbital defense platforms and patrolled by dozens of Larethian cruisers. Subtle, Ethan muttered, adjusting the straps of his tactical harness. They don't do anything halfway, do they? They see grandeur as strength. Lysira replied, her voice calm but laced with an edge of determination. But it's also their greatest weakness. They underestimate the resourceful. Ethan shot her a wry grin. Good thing that's your specialty. She allowed herself a faint smile. And yours. The plan they had devised was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Ethan would infiltrate the throne world's lower levels, where the stolen human superweapon, a devastating energy-based annihilator, was being housed. His mission was to disable it before it could be deployed against humanity and the Loyalist forces. Meanwhile, Lysira would lead a direct assault on the palace, confronting the remnants of Caratha's forces and the corrupt council members who had betrayed her. We'll only get one shot at this, Ethan said, checking his gear one last time. If things go south. They won't, Lysira interrupted, her tone firm. We've come too far to fail now. Ethan nodded, meeting her gaze. Then let's finish this. The assault begins. The Loyalist fleet emerged from hyperspace with precision, their ships darting through the gaps in the orbital defenses like needles threading through fabric. The Larethian forces scrambled to respond, but the Loyalists struck with a ferocity that took them by surprise. Explosions lit up the dark void as the battle raged in orbit. Under the cover of the chaos, Ethan's stealth shuttle slipped through the planetary defenses, landing in a concealed maintenance dock on the throne world's surface. He disembarked quickly, his injured leg still aching but functional. The corridors of the maintenance sector were eerily quiet, the hum of machinery the only sound. Ethan moved with practiced efficiency, his every step calculated to avoid detection. Meanwhile, Lysira led the Loyalist ground forces in a daring charge toward the palace gates. The defenders were well trained and heavily armed, but Lysira was a force of nature. She moved through the battlefield with supernatural speed and precision, her claws and fangs ablur as she cut down her enemies. Her Loyalists, inspired by her resolve, fought with renewed vigor, pressing the attack despite the overwhelming odds. Ethan's infiltration. Ethan's path through the maintenance sector brought him to the entrance of the superweapons containment facility. The air grew colder as he approached, the faint hum of energy growing louder. The weapon was housed in a massive chamber, its design eerily familiar, a testament to humanity's ingenuity, twisted and corrupted by Larethian hands. A pair of guards stood watch at the entrance, their crimson eyes scanning the corridor. Ethan took cover behind a stack of crates, assessing the situation. He couldn't afford a prolonged firefight, the noise would draw reinforcements. Instead, he crafted a distraction, using a small explosive charge to trigger a distant alarm. As the guards moved to investigate, Ethan slipped into the chamber. The weapon was a marvel of engineering, its sleek, metallic frame pulsing with raw energy. It was connected to a series of conduits that ran along the walls, each one feeding power into the device. Disabling it wouldn't be easy, but Ethan had faced worse odds. He approached the weapon's control panel, his hands moving swiftly as he bypassed the security protocols. Alarms blared as the system detected his intrusion, but Ethan remained focused. He planted explosive charges along the main power conduits, setting them on a timer. Just as he finished, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the chamber. Ethan turned to see a squad of Larethian enforcers entering, their weapons trained on him. Great! He muttered, drawing his pistol. The ensuing firefight was brutal. Ethan used the cover of the conduits and machinery to his advantage, taking down the enforcers one by one. But his ammunition was running low, and reinforcements would arrive soon. He activated the timer on the charges, setting it for 3 minutes. With the weapon primed to be destroyed, Ethan made his escape, sprinting through the corridors as the countdown ticked away. The facility shook with the force of the explosion, a deafening roar that sent shockwaves through the structure. The superweapon was no more. Lysira's confrontation. At the palace gates, Lysira and her forces breached the final line of defense, storming into the Grand Hall. The chamber was a testament to Vlarithian arrogance, its walls adorned with crystalline mosaics depicting their conquests. At the center of the room stood the remnants of the ruling council, their expressions a mix of fear and defiance. "You have no right to be here," one of them snarled. "You were exiled." "I was betrayed," Lysira replied coldly, stepping forward. "But that ends today." From the shadows, Kareth emerged, his crimson eyes burning with rage. "You think you can take my throne? You're still the same weak, sentimental fool." Lysira met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "And you're still a coward hiding behind others. Let's end this." The duel that followed was nothing short of epic. Kareth fought with ruthless precision, his strikes aimed to exploit Lysira's every weakness. But Lysira had grown stronger, not just physically but emotionally. She fought with purpose, each blow a testament to her determination to reclaim her honor. The battle raged across the grand hall, the two combatants a blur of motion. Lysira's loyalists watched in awe as their queen held her ground, her strength and resolve unmatched. Finally, with a decisive strike, she brought Kareth to his knees, his weapon clattering to the floor. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. "You've lost." Kareth glared at her, his face twisted with hatred. "You think this changes anything? You'll never be accepted as queen." Lysira's gaze softened, not with pity but with resolve. "Perhaps. But I'll rebuild our people on my terms, not yours." She turned to the council, her voice ringing with authority. "This empire will no longer be built on fear and cruelty. From this day forward, we will stand for something greater. Victory and transformation." As the Loyalists secured the palace, Lysira and Ethan reunited in the grand hall. Ethan, battered but alive, grinned as he approached her. "Guess we did it, Queen." Lysira allowed herself a rare smile. "We did." The victory was hard-earned, but it marked a turning point for the Vlarithians. Under Lysira's leadership, they began to rebuild, their society shifting toward a future of compassion and unity. Ethan, having destroyed the superweapon, ensured humanity's safety and cemented his place as a trusted ally. In the days that followed, Lysira made a startling discovery. Her exposure to Ethan's humanity, his resilience, his compassion, had triggered a transformation in her physiology. She no longer needed to feed on others to survive. Her evolution became a symbol of hope, proof that even the most entrenched traditions could be changed. As they stood together on the balcony of the palace, overlooking the twilight skies of the throne world, Ethan turned to Lysira. "So, what now?" "We rebuild," she said simply. "Together." Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, they faced the future with hope. The Queen had redeemed herself, and the human who had saved her had found a purpose greater than survival. Together, they were unstoppable.